So today we begin a new sermon series called Sermon on the Mount, or Summer on the Mount. This all summer, we're going to be going through this series, June, July, and then a part of August, wrestling with two questions. Who was Jesus, and what did he teach? Now, we're in a more open church, and so how we're going to approach this would be a little bit different than other churches might approach this. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about history. So it's kind of a historical context behind a lot of leading up to the time of Jesus and what did the time of Jesus look like. And then next week, just to kind of give you guys a little bit of a heads up, we're going to talk about the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Who wrote those? When were they written? To whom were they written? We're going to jump into that. And then 2 weeks from now, I'm really excited for this. We'll see how it goes. We're going to talk about 4 different ways of looking at Jesus. This will be stretching for some of us. For some of us, we might find it really refreshing. But there is different ways of understanding who Jesus was under the Christian umbrella, or even if you don't consider yourself a Christian, a follower of Jesus or somebody influenced by Jesus. So that's kind of where we're headed. And then we're going to dive into the Sermon on the Mount for the rest of July. Sound good? Everybody's with me? And also, we're extending lots of grace here today for kids who are in the service, so parents, don't feel bad. If your kid drops some crayons on the floor, I heard a little bit of that, that's okay. We're all extending lots of grace here this morning. So let's jump in. So next slide here, we have a map. This map is a first century Palestine. So if you look at the body of water on the south end, towards the bottom is the Dead Sea. One of the lowest, I think it's the lowest part on the earth, or one of the lowest parts. And if you follow the Dead Sea on up to the north, that body of water is the Sea of Galilee. Connecting those two is the Jordan River, right? The Sea of Galilee, around that area, is where most of Jesus' teachings take place, is in Galilee. And the next slide we can see here, Jesus was born or at least raised in Nazareth. Some of the Gospels have him born in Bethlehem. We'll talk a little bit about that next week. But you can see Nazareth on the very southwest corner. But Jesus moved and started his public ministry at Capernaum. Capernaum is a shore right off of the Sea of Galilee on the north side. That's where Jesus spent most of his public ministry, was along that place. So again, a lot of this is going to be history. Some of this you already know, and I'm hoping that part of this, at least something you'll be able to grab that will help you understand the life of Jesus as you read the Christian scriptures or the New Testament or the Gospels a little bit more. And then we're going to kind of rest at a story of the Good Samaritan today. So how did we get here? How did the Hebrew people come to the land of Canaan, or the first century Palestine? So the next slide we have, it starts with the story of Abraham. Most of us are familiar with that. Abraham's story begins in Genesis 12. Before Genesis 12, we have a lot of mythic stories of creation, floods, different things. But the Israelite story begins really in Genesis 12 with the story of Abraham. Scholars disagree. When did Abraham live? Roughly between 2200 to 1800 BCE. That's a rough estimate of the time of Abraham. Next slide here, we're moving through these kind of quickly. The next slide is the journey of Abraham. And if you look, he starts on the very southeast corner in a land called Ur, modern-day southern Iraq. We're going to talk about Babylon a little bit, but if you look at a little bit farther north from there is Babylon. So according to the biblical account, Abraham and his family migrated up the Euphrates River to the land of Haran, or the city of Haran, and they camped out there. Interesting fact, it's not pertinent right now, but both Ur and the city of Haran were both centers with temples to, I think it's the sun god Sin, spelt like sin, S-I-N. So it's very likely that Abraham and his family were influenced, if not a part of the worship of this sun god Sin. And then his family stays in Haran. Eventually, Abraham and his family migrate south down to, you can see kind of Jerusalem on the shoreline area there, down to the land of Canaan. That's where they begin to dwell. And they take a trip down farther to Egypt and then kind of back. Those are the 2 arrows there. The Israelites eventually, according to the Bible, wind up in the land of Canaan. They kind of multiply, grow. There's this famine that comes along. And if you're familiar at all with the story of Joseph and the multicolored coat or the coat of many colors, what happens is a lot of the people migrate down to Egypt. They find food in Egypt. Eventually, they become slaves in the land of Egypt. And who can tell me the name of the person who frees them? Moses. So the next slide here we have Moses lives around 1290 BCE. The Exodus story, many scholars believe, happened sometime around 1250 BCE. The Exodus story is this incredible story of a group of people migrating out of slavery, out of Egypt, crossing the Dead Sea, while the Red Sea, while the Red Sea was split open on dry land, eventually winding up in Israel. Earlier this year, we did a whole series, the Hebrew Bible in a Postmodern World is what it was called. So we tackled this question. Because there's a lot of younger ears here, I'm not going to jump into it too much. Suffice it to say that lots of that story is unlikely to have happened the way the Bible says it has happened. Or at least history, archaeology, other historical evidence doesn't suggest that it happened that way. So then how did the Israelites wind up in the land of Canaan? We really don't know. There's a couple of suggestions or thoughts. What seem to be the most prominent are two kind of different paths. One of it is the Israelites came into the land of Canaan relatively peacefully. Maybe during the time of Abraham, they came in, they settled, and they began to grow and multiply. People that advocate that view tend to see a lot of similarities between the Canaanite religion and the religion of the Hebrew people. And they must have connected in some way in their worship and how they worshiped and what they did during their worship times. Another way of understanding this is that the Israelite people came in and were involved in some sort of battles. Maybe they were in Egypt as slaves, and maybe some of them did migrate up and they had some battles and stuff as they conquered and settled into that land. If you're interested at all in that concept, there's a great podcast. One of my favorite scholars, Peter Enns, has a podcast called The Bible for Normal People. So if I can understand it, you can probably understand it. He interviewed a scholar named Kenton Sparks on this, and he's actually coming out with a book titled, Where Did the Israelite People Come From? But just know that scholars themselves disagree. It's uncertain. They're still trying to figure out that question. But they wound up there. And so they lived in the land of Canaan, but eventually the Babylonians came in and conquered Jerusalem. They sacked Jerusalem, sacked the temple. The next slide here we have a map. Lots of maps today. Next slide, just stay on this slide, sorry. This is the Babylonian Empire in red during its peak. Again, Babylon is kind of more towards the southeast corner. So they migrated all the way north and then came down south, down to the land of Canaan. Let's pause here for a second. One of the reasons why we read in a lot of the Old Testament in the Hebrew Bible that there was so many wars and people coming in and invading the Israelites is because if you look at the land of Canaan, basically just below Syria, all the way south, almost to Egypt. It says Negev there, but just south of Jerusalem, that land was relatively sparse, unsettled, rural, but it had some major highways, trade routes going from the north, so Babylon, Assyria, and all those other countries, down to Egypt, as well as you see that little town called, I forget how to say it, Tyre or something. That was like a major hub port. So people would come in there trading from the sea. Rome and other people would come in that way. So if you look at it, there's all kinds of conquests and people coming in, constantly invading. You're like, oh, these poor little Hebrew people, what's going on? It's because they lived in a land that had some major trade routes. This is important land. It was also hard for most of the empires to kind of keep. All the way east, past the land of Canaan, is a lot of desert. So there's only kind of one way through that little sliver of land, ancient Near East, right there where people came. So the Canaanite or the Hebrew people lived in the land of Canaan until about 587 BCE. 587 is a really, really important date because many scholars believe that most of the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament, was written down while they were living in exile during 587 to 537 BCE. So why would that be? Now, it's not, they had stories that were passed down orally. Some of it was already written down. But because they were conquered, they were wrestling with the question of who are we? What just happened? Where is our God? Their view of God was very geographical, if that makes sense. So a way of understanding this would be, we're in Chandler. So let's say Chandler has a god, Chi. Our God is Chi, 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 Chi. And then what's another? Mesa. We'll just say Mesa. Mesa has the god D. We'll just call him D, right? So Mesa comes down, conquers our land, Chandler, Chi, takes our property and brings it up, brings all the people up there. So what happens now in the ancient Near Eastern mindset is that our god, Chi, has now been either destroyed or comes under Mesa's god, D. That's how they understood. So the Israelite people, the Hebrew people, were questioning, why did this happen? Our God is strong, right? Our God is mighty. Then why were we conquered and why are we living in Babylon right now? Where are you, God? Are we really the people of God? What happened? So a lot of the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, were written primarily to show this. God was faithful. It wasn't God's unfaithfulness, nor was it because Yahweh, their God, was weak, but it was because of their unfaithfulness to God, because they did not practice what God had taught them. They did not keep the laws and the instructions. They did not look out for the poor among them, and thus God allowed them to be taken away into captivity. Make a little bit of sense? That's a lot of the Old Testament and where it's written from. Part of it was written, of course, after the exile, when they were allowed to return back to the land of Canaan and rebuild the temple. So the next slide we have, after 537 BCE, the Assyrians came in, conquered Babylon, and allowed the Jewish people to return back to their homeland. Not everybody did. Some of them stayed in Babylon. By the way, when they were in Babylon, they assimilated into, some of them, the Jewish people assimilated into their culture, into their language, Aramaic. They began to learn that language. So there's a lot of influence Babylon had on some of these people. But then the Assyrians came, they conquered Babylon, allowed them to return in 537 BCE. Some key dates. Next slide. A lot of history here. You guys still with me? This is a different kind of lesson. But 515 BCE is when the Hebrew people finally concluded their building of the second temple. This is their temple in Jerusalem. They were allowed to return, rebuild the temple. So scholars will call 515 to about 70 CE the second temple period. And 70 CE is when the Romans came back in and wiped out the temple. So there's no more temple after 70 CE. Just to put it in context, Jesus emerges, was born probably around 4 BCE. So our dating is a little bit off. It's not quite 0. He was born a little bit before that. Oops, what are you going to do? 30 CE is about the time of Jesus' death. We're going to get more into this next week, but the gospel, the first gospel to have been written, the Gospel of Mark, was written in 70 CE, 40 years after the death of Jesus. That's good to know. We'll talk about this next week. So, next slide, just to give us an overview up to the time of Jesus. You have the Persian period, of course, when they were allowed to come back in and rebuild. It was during this time where synagogues began to emerge, during the Persian period. And before this time, the temple was everything to the Jewish people. That was where you went to make sacrifices to worship God. During the Persian period, synagogues began to form. What were synagogues? They were places where people went to learn the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Torah can be translated law or instruction. How are we meant to live? Then when we have the Hellenistic period where Alexander the Great comes in and conquers, then the Hasmonean period. This is where a group of Jewish rebels named the Maccabees, nickname meaning Maccabees meaning hammers, revolted against their oppressors, and they won their independence. They then rededicated the temple. This is where the Jewish celebration, the festival of Hanukkah, comes from. When they rededicated the temple, they won their independence. Freedom, right? Then the Romans came in. Actually, what happened is the Hasmoneans, they created this nation state with different rulers. They started to war at each other. So by the time the Romans got there, it was like easy pickings. Oh, you guys are already destroying each other? We'll come in, we'll take over the land. Of course, it was during the Roman period that the life of Jesus takes place, 63 BCE to 70 CE. So this was a time, the point in the sermon, where I was going to invite someone else to come up and speak, and that person wasn't able to make it here today, but they were going to share a little bit about their trip to the Holy Land, show kind of pictures to give us a context of it. But it was actually Jacob's wife, Laurel, and she had to stay home for her child had an accident, one of their kids. So, Laurel, if you're watching, we're sorry, but thanks for being with us. And so we're going to kind of move on. We're going to work with this today, flexibility here today. So we're going to jump in, and I am going to jump down to the slide with the key figures, if you can. Thank you, Susie. So who are some of the key figures during the time of Jesus? Now we're jumping into first century Palestine. So I'm actually going to start below with the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the most powerful Jewish sect during the time of first century Palestine. The Sadducees were the people they were the priests who ran the temple. They lived in Jerusalem. They're not mentioned that much in the New Testament because most of Jesus's public ministry happens outside of Jerusalem. But it's most likely, when the New Testament talks about high priests or chief priests, it is the Sadducees. If you were a Sadducee, you were among the upper echelons of society. You were the chief priest, but you were very wealthy. Living in Jerusalem, people admire you. You were also, some people struggled with this, in cahoots, so to speak, with some of the Romans. They would go to you and you would kind of mediate between the rest of the people, and not everybody liked that for obvious reasons. The Pharisees were a group, most of us are probably most familiar with the Pharisees. They get a bad rap. We know them as being legalistic and hypocritical. For example, in Matthew 23, Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat but swallow a camel." So Jesus confronted the Pharisees head on time and time again. They get a bad rap. It is probably most true to say he was most aligned with the Pharisees as a sect. And his views, the way he saw the world, he encountered the Pharisees the most, and that's why we see so much friction between Jesus and the Pharisees. The Pharisees, again, were the group of scribes, often lawyers, others that were meant to teach faithfulness to the Torah. Now, they were extremely strict in what they taught. They were interpreting the Torah. What does it mean for us today to follow the Torah? Now, of course, on the legalistic side, we see that they give a lot of extra rules and hoops to jump through. But what we often miss is behind that, there's actually a lot of good rooted in that. Primarily, they gave a lot of strict rules and guidelines because for them, every table was an altar, every house was a temple, and every man was a priest. So they began to say, hey, this isn't just for certain people, elite people to live by. This is for all Jews to live by. So let's all rise up and live to this standard. So in a way, there's some good behind that, although I think they took it to extreme. It caused a lot of legalistic rituals and rules that were hard to follow for a lot of people. But it's interesting to see their view, where that comes from, I think is actually really good and wholesome, in that they were trying to lift, hey, we're all on the same page here together. Let's learn how to all live the Torah. It's not just for those Sadducees who hang out in the temple. It's for all of us. So that's interesting to know. Another group were called the Essenes. The Essenes were an ascetic separatist who lived in private communities, kind of like desert monks, we would say. They were often off to the side, living in their own communities. They held very strong messianic beliefs, apocalyptic. God is coming with divine judgment here and now. We're separating ourselves from this place. It's likely, most likely, that the Essenes were a part of the community in Qumran. Next slide, we have a map. No, okay, let's just stay there. This is a side-by-side comparison that I forgot to mention of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, kind of different views, different beliefs. The Pharisees were more focused on the law, the Torah, the Sadducees on the temple. Pharisees, what does the Torah say? How do we interpret it? Making these laws longer, bigger, inviting people up. Pharisees were more middle class, Sadducees upper class. They had different beliefs and views. By the way, Jews in the first century Palestine did not all agree on everything. So you have one sect that believed in the resurrection of the dead. You had another group of priests that did not believe. You had a group that believed in the afterlife. You had another group that did not believe in the afterlife. So even in the first century Palestine, there was no uniformity. There was no one view of everything else. There was all kinds of different views going on in that. Let's go to the next slide. It should be the map of Qumran. So we see here in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the land of Qumran. Actually, luckily enough, I think he was a goat herder, and he was a young teenager who just stumbled upon, in these caves, these ancient scrolls in 1947. So you can see kind of the distance between Jerusalem and Qumran off the shore of the Dead Sea. The next slide here gives us an idea of the lay of the land at Qumran. These are the Qumran caves at the very south corner. I've kind of showed a little bit about some of these pictures in the past here. But if you look on the very bottom, you'll see in those are some of the caves that they lived in. How would you like to live there 2,000 years ago? Probably pretty tough, all right? This is for the hardy type of person. They believed in what they were doing, right? That gives you an idea. By the way, some scholars believe that John the Baptist, who baptized Jesus, was an Essene or influenced by the Essenes, which would have made sense. Very messianic, very apocalyptic. Also, fewer, but some think that Jesus was or influenced by a group of the Essenes. There's no way to prove or disprove that. It's just interesting information knowing. The Essenes are never mentioned in the New Testament specifically. We just know they existed and they had an influence. Next slide, we'll talk about the Zealots really quick, and we're going to settle on the Samaritans, kind of read a story there. So the Zealots, again, were not mentioned in the New Testament other than the term Simon the Zealot, which most people think of meant more like zealous one, Simon full of zeal, not really the title. But Zealots were Jewish rebels who advocated for armed rebellion, revolt against the Romans. Underneath there, some of them were called the Sicarii, which they basically carried. They were like assassins, right? They carried these little daggers in their cloaks, and they would find people and like, oh, this is a politician, this is somebody I don't like that's high in the Jewish leadership that's in cahoots with the Romans. They would find a public place, get in there, whip out their dagger, jab them, stick it back in, and walk away, or hopefully get away scot-free, right? So this group was the radicals, those who were rebelling against Romans using violence. It's interesting to try to figure out where Jesus would have fallen in these, influenced by different ones, but obviously was not aligned with the Zealots in that way, advocating for armed rebellion. Jesus did not. I kind of sounded like Yoda there, huh? Jesus did not. The Samaritans, we're going to rest here. The next slide, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. If you see this section of first century Palestine, which is everything really east of or west of the Jordan River there, between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, or they call it here the Salt Sea, there's three distinct regions. On the very south, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, it was called the region of Judea. Just north of that, in that blue area, the region of Samaria. And then just north of that, in the orange, is Galilee, Jesus was born in Galilee in Nazareth, lived in Galilee in Capernaum. Again, we won't get into it, but some of the Gospels have Jesus born in Bethlehem. So there's two places there. But either way, Jesus mostly grew up in the region of Galilee. Samaria was despised by many of the Jewish people. In fact, a lot of times they would walk around it, even crossing the river, walking to the other side to go from Judea to Galilee. Who were the Samaritans? The Samaritans had their own temple where they worshiped on Mount Gerizim. They claimed it was the original temple and that the temple in Jerusalem was a fake temple or a secondary place of worship. In fact, in one of the exchanges, somebody asked Jesus, where do we worship? At the mountain, the temple in Gerizim or the temple in Jerusalem? Which is the place? And Jesus basically answers, neither. Someday we'll just worship at any place. And so you can see a little bit of the rivalry there. The Samaritans, by the way, had their own interpretation of the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible, slightly varied and different than the Jewish Torah in key places. In fact, one of the key places in the 10 Commandments, where for the Samaritans, in their Pentateuch, it says that the only place to worship God is in the Mount of Gerizim. So interesting, the contrast between these two people groups. The Jews believed that they alone were the chosen ones of God, and that the Samaritans were one of two people. Either one was bad, by the way. They were either descendants of foreign colonists whom the Assyrians brought into the land, or they were the offspring of Israelite people, Jewish people who had forsaken their traditions and intermarried with foreigners. Almost like Samaritans were like half-breeds. Oh, you were like us, but you forsook the law and became intermarried with pagan people. So they were despised. Both groups despised the other. Both of the religious leaders of both sides taught that you are not to talk to or interact with the other group. And interesting how you have a land and it's divided right in the middle with Samaritans, and then in the north and the south you have the other Jews, and that contraction or contrast there. So I want to invite us now to read. Hopefully, by the way, some of this will be helpful. I know as we go forward, some of this will be helpful for us as we read and understand the New Testament in our own way. But one way that this can cross over is in the Good Samaritan story, and it helps us to understand the story a little bit more, what was going on in the context. So let's read that together. It's in Luke 10. Let's go to the next slide. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Now let's pause there. Verse 25. When this lawyer, first of all, he's testing Jesus, but when he asks about eternal life, let's not go as many people automatically go. So he's asking, how do I get saved and go to heaven when I die? Because that's probably not what he's asking. He's probably more along the line, how do I have abundant life, full life, life in the kingdom? How do I walk into this abundant life now? And Jesus says to him this, what is written in the law? So he asks him back a question, what do you read there? So the lawyer answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said to him, you have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live. Let's pause there for a second. The lawyer asked Jesus, what must I do to have this abundant life? And what does Jesus say? If you believe all the right things about me and who I am, then you will be saved or have abundant life. No, he says nothing about right beliefs. In fact, he says, you responded well. It's right action. You love. You love God. You love others as yourself. That is the way to abundant life. And then he goes and tells this interesting story. Let's move on to the next slide. And Jesus says, the lawyer says, wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? So here we have a man trying to justify himself, obviously wrestling with that, knowing I should love my neighbor, but who is my neighbor really? Where does that line end here? So Jesus replies by telling the story. There was a man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, fell to the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, went away, leaving him half dead. Now by a chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, pass by on the other side. Let's go to the next slide. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him. When he saw him, he was moved with pity, went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? Let's go back one slide here. So Jesus tells this story of a Jewish man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, beat up, robbed, left for dead, probably to a Jewish audience. What happens? A Jewish priest, one of the high echelons of their society, comes by. Of course a priest would help. They're holy people, right? Walks by. Next, we have a Levite, another Jewish man, comes by, walks right past him. Let's go to the next slide. But a Samaritan. Now, putting that in context, and I'm probably sure many of us have heard some version of this before, if you were giving this story to a bunch of Jews, they would be wrestling with offense right now. This half-breed, this Samaritan, there's a clear box. We're in it, and the Samaritans are not in it. We have the right beliefs. We worship at the right place. We have the correct scriptures, and the Samaritans do not. And Jesus tells this story and completely flips it upside down. In fact, I think breaks the box wide open and says, yeah, just because you think you have everything figured out, look at this Samaritan. And he tells the story and he says, now who was actually loving their neighbor? Remember, that's how you have eternal life, abundant life, is to love your neighbor. Underneath this, by the way, is Jesus is basically, the Samaritan is the one who has that life because his actions prove that he was loving his neighbor. Undergirding a lot of this view of having the correct view, having the correct religion, having the correct beliefs, having the correct place you worship, all the labels that we think are right. And this story just undermines it all. I guarantee if I was a Jew sitting there, that would be offensive. I would be ingrained in that culture, expanding that. Oh my goodness. Who are those that we have struggled loving? Who are those that we think are in or are out? Christians, I think, throughout history have repeated this over and over and over. We have the one correct, right way of believing and thinking. And those Jews, Muslims, agnostics, other Christians are wrong. Can I be honest? I'm going to take one more step here. Jesus' teachings are very offensive to some people. Jesus' teachings are only really offensive to religious people. Jesus really only offended religious people during his time. Think about if he was here today. I kind of suspect it would be pretty true. I think it would be religious people that would have the hardest time understanding Jesus' teachings and incorporating it. So here's an interesting story in context that stretches, that I think just does away with all these labels. I know we like labels. I like them. I have a tendency to think I'm better because I believe in science and these don't, and I believe in this. So who is that other in your life? Is it the Republicans? Is it the Democrats? Is it the conservatives? Who is that other who Jesus, if he told this story to you, might put in there instead of the Samaritans in that place?